Hello, my name is David Schanzer, and I'm a professor of public policy at the Sanford Institute at Duke University and director of the Triangle Center on Terrorism and Homeland Security. We're very privileged to have with us today to participate in the Duke Living History Series, Admiral John Poindexter. Admiral Poindexter had a distinguished career in the Navy, served in the Reagan White House, and in recent years has been involved in technological development to deal with our counterterrorism efforts. And it's a real privilege to be with you today and to interview you for part of this series. Admiral Poindexter, welcome to Duke.
Thank you, David.
Admiral, starting right from the beginning, last night I looked up Odin, Indiana on the map and found that it was quite far from either of our oceans. How did a person growing up in Odin end up becoming a Navy officer?
Well, David, I've been asked that question, as you might expect, many times. My father, who was a banker, always wished that he could have gone to one of the service academies, and he actually wanted me to go to West Point. But I was interested in going to one of the service academies, but I didn't want to go to West Point. I wanted to go to the Naval Academy. And I'm not sure that I can recollect exactly what influenced me to do that, but a humorous story. When I graduated from the Naval Academy in 1958, the Indianapolis Star, which is a major newspaper in the state, ran an editorial that was titled "Another Cornfield Admiral." And it was the article, the editorial described Admiral Spruance, who was a naval hero of the Second World War, the Battle of Midway, came from Indiana. And the Star was predicting that someday I might be an admiral. And they were pondering why people from Indiana would be interested in going to sea, and they jokingly said, well, maybe it's the waving fields of grain. But I was always interested in naval history and decided that's what I wanted to do, and did it.
Growing up as you did in the shadow of World War II, what did the concept of national security mean during that era to you, and how does it differ from our perceptions of national security now?
Well, growing up during the war, my most vivid memories are having cardboard toys and rationing in terms of food and gasoline and rubber tires and things like that. I don't think as a young fellow I had much thought about what national security really meant. It was pretty clear to me that we were in a battle to preserve our way of life. And of course today I have a more sophisticated view of what's involved in national security. But as a young man, I don't think I really thought about it very much.
Much of your career in the Navy really revolved around the development and use of computer technology. What was technological development like in the early days of computers, and what was the military's attitude towards that?
Well, when I was a midshipman, we didn't have digital computers. They were analog devices. A fire control computer then was a bunch of gears and wheels and knobs that you had to adjust. And the Navy, in terms of solving the fire control problem, in other words, directing the guns and the torpedoes and other weapons, used computers, analog type computers from very early days. And as we moved into the electronic era, the computers were still primarily used for fire control systems and for combat information systems, even as late as, I guess late 70s. There weren't any computers on board for personnel accounting, finances, supply, things like that. There were computers ashore, but for those purposes. But we didn't have any computers on board for that, and there were no computers for what I would describe as analytical tools to help decision makers. It wasn't until the late 80s that computers started going aboard ships for things other than fire control and combat information.
The pace of technological development now is so fast compared, and you've been tracking this for such a long time. Does the pace always seem fast in the era that you're living in at the time, or looking back on it, does it look like it was slow then and fast now? How do you compare eras when you're looking at technology?
Well, when you're participating in the process, I think it's a little hard to evaluate it. But certainly my feeling is that the rate of change of technology is increasing very rapidly. It is not a linear function, but it's more of an exponential function. For example, if you may have remember from the lecture last night, it's been said that by 2010, 50% of the world's electrical power generation will be used for information processing. That's an enormous number, but it gives one an idea about how fast things are changing. That's only in 4 years from now.
When you talk to retired Navy officers, they really seem to wax eloquent and look back with great fondness on their time as a commander of a boat.
Right.
Can you explain? A ship, of course, excuse me. Could you explain why that is, and what is it that makes that essentially usually the highlight of a commander's career?
Well, that's certainly true in my case. That the tour that I liked the best of my whole career was when I was commanding officer of a cruiser.
And what years were that?
That was, let's see, 74 to 76.
Okay.
And by the way, boats are carried on ships, and so that's the distinction between a ship and a boat. But I think the reason that position is so memorable to naval officers is that the independent responsibility that you have for commanding the ship, the 500 plus people on board, depending on the size of the ship, but you are essentially the mayor, the police chief, the fire chief, the counselor, the pastor to some extent, and it's your responsibility to make sure that the lives of the people aboard the ship are protected, that the ship carries out its mission. You don't, at least in the earlier years, you didn't have a lot of outside interference. Ships operate alone at sea, surrounded only by water. Now, today, with communications the way they are, I think if you talk to a commanding officer from more recent times, they might have a different view about outside direction and interference. But there's an abbreviation that is often used in naval messages, and it's UNODIR, you know dear, which stands for unless otherwise directed. So many times when you're off operating by yourself, you see something that needs to be done, and you'll send a message out to your commander somewhere else and tell him, unless otherwise directed, this is what I'm going to do. And of course, if he disagrees, he'll come back and say no, but usually there's just no response. That they understand that you're using your best judgment to accomplish whatever the task is. And that's a very attractive position to be in, at least for me.
And in the mid-'70s, when you were commanding a ship, where were you, and what was your mission?
I was in the Western Pacific. It was at the end of the Vietnam War. We were in the South China Sea, the Gulf of Tonkin, primarily on station to protect the carriers that were operating further offshore, watching for aircraft coming out of Hainan and North Vietnam.
Well, we'll get back to Vietnam in a second, but you were a naval officer from 1958 all the way to the late 80s, 30 years, really dominated by the period of the Cold War. What was your perception as a young officer in the United States Navy of the Soviet Union?
That it was a significant threat to the Western world and to the United States specifically. That the Western countries had united together in NATO, the North Atlantic Treaty Organization, and there was real concern that the Soviet Union might try to invade Western Europe again. There was concern about the nuclear weapons, essentially the standoff that existed between the United States and the Soviet Union. There was always suspicion and in some cases evidence of the Soviets not abiding by the various arms control treaties. And in fact, an interesting point later on when President Reagan decided to begin what we called the Strategic Defense Initiative, which the Soviets protested, but in reality, the Soviets at the time had their own Strategic Defense Initiative that was classified information at the time, but it was pretty clear to me, and I agree with President Reagan when he called the Soviet Union an evil empire. I really think it was evil, and glad to see it gone.
Let me ask you this: were we at war with the Soviet Union?
Were we at war?
Yes, we use the term Cold War, but that was a term invented or used at first by historians and journalists. Were we at war?
Well, it's interesting. It's sort of like the war on terror today.
Well, I was going to ask you that just after this, so I was going to get your sense.
Well, I guess technically speaking, the United States is only at war if there is a declaration of war. And during the Cold War and today with the war on terror, there is no declaration of war. So I guess...
Yeah, the president today is consistently saying we are at war and invoking
Yeah.
the powers of the executive during wartime. So,
Yeah, it's. I'm not a constitutional lawyer.
Right.
I'm not a lawyer
Right.
as you are.
well, it's not required to have an opinion on this question. This is a question of history.
Yeah. Um, I think the reason presidents and I can't remember under which president the term Cold War was used, but I think it is a way of trying to energize the people of the country, to make them understand that there is a serious security threat, and so people informally call it a war. But I think technically, it probably isn't a war unless there is a declaration of war.
Okay. Can we sustain war, over the Cold War? We knew at the time was going to be a war of decades, and we say that the war on terrorism is going to be a war of decades.
Yeah.
We had the threat against the Soviet threat, of course, was thousands of nuclear missiles. Well, we're concerned, of course, about terrorists obtaining weapons of mass destruction. In some ways, we weren't at war in the technical sense in the Cold War, yet, as I was mentioning, that the President does invoke war powers now. I'm trying to see if there are comparisons and what are the important differences between those two.
Well, clearly, I think, as I said a moment ago, one of the reasons that presidents do invoke the term war is to try to capture the interest and the participation and the help from the people of the country. I think one of the problems that we had during Vietnam, and if my memory serves me right, there was never a declaration of war there either. In fact, I don't even think in the Korean War that was, I think that was referred to often as a police action, not a war. And so the last war, legally speaking, using legal terminology, was the Second World War, in the war against Germany and the Axis powers in Japan. I think one of the things that concerns me today is that there are a lot of people in the country that don't think that they're involved. And I think this happened during the Vietnam War. The policy of having, I can remember the slogan was "Guns and Butter," is probably not the right way to approach these problems. I think in order to maintain the support of the American public, it's important that they be involved. And as an example, after 9/11, and I was in DARPA, I started some study, a research project, on what I referred to as internet-based civil defense. And the idea was to upgrade the idea of civil defense to the modern technological age and modern communications methods. And it seemed to me the internet was a good way of doing that. But one of the objectives that I wanted to achieve with this idea, and it was only an idea, we never moved to do anything about it, but one of the objectives of the idea was a way to involve more of the public in the fight against terror. And and it wasn't just a cynical sort of thing. I mean, I think the American public could contribute a lot, especially in terms of crisis response, but operated sort of like the neighborhood watch program that exists in many communities, where people know each other and privacy isn't so much of an issue if you start at the neighborhood level. And it would be a way of involving the people more in addressing the problem and providing for our security. Now, in the civil defense program of the 50s, there's a very interesting report out and was written some time ago called the East River Project, which describes the civil defense program of the 50s. And it's interesting that a lot of the things that were done prior to that, I mean, there was civil defense effort during the war, and a lot of things that were done in those programs during the war were done for the reason only of involving the people. For instance, collecting string, collecting tinfoil, collecting kapok for life jackets. A lot of that activity, the stuff was just stockpiled and never used. But the important point was that it made the people feel like they were helping to contribute to the eventual victory. And we missed those kinds of approaches in the Vietnam War, and I think we're missing them in the global war on terror.
Let's talk first about Vietnam. You talked about how you were in command during the war. What was the impact of Vietnam and the outcome of that conflict on the military itself?
Well, I think it had various impacts. There were many officers that rose to a higher rank later who took the attitude of Vietnam never again, and were largely opposed to the use of military force for any reason other than a direct attack on the United States. There are others, and I put myself in the other category, that felt that we didn't, as a country, we didn't do a very good job of explaining what was at stake, that we didn't, as I said a moment ago, we didn't do a very good job of involving more of the people of the country. And I'm jumping around a bit, but another thing that plays into this is the all-volunteer force today. Certainly from a training standpoint, from a financial standpoint, the all-volunteer force is very effective, and many senior officers like it. It makes their jobs easier. But on the other hand, it involves doing away with the draft. Means that you involve fewer people in the country in the war, and it puts a distance between the military and a majority of the population. This was very true during the Vietnam War. It's less true today for some reason that I don't think I understand, but you see all sorts of scenes of servicemen in airports that are being cheered and hands shaken by people in the airport. There's more of an appreciation today of the United States military than there was during the Vietnam War.
Did we draw the right lessons or the wrong lessons from Vietnam, or a little bit of both, as you were implying?
I think I would like to believe that we learned the right lessons.
Which were?
Which were that it's not just an attack on the United States, although that transpired on 9/11. But I think there's more of a recognition in the country that we face a serious threat. The armed forces are and the domestic law enforcement agencies and the Homeland Security Department that you were involved with earlier, that we're more together as a country. Although there's a lot of debate about Iraq. That's a slightly different issue, but I think that a majority of the country understands that we face a severe problem with terror.
And how did you came to the White House not long after the Vietnam conflict ended? How did Vietnam and the outcome there impact our kind of national security decision making over the decades following?
Well, as I said earlier, there were a lot of military leaders and some civilian leaders that were opposed to using military force. For example, at the beginning of the Reagan administration, we had a problem in Lebanon. The Israelis had gone in really against our wishes, but that put us in a situation where the president felt we needed to deploy troops to Lebanon in order to provide some stability. Some military officers at the time, and the chairman of the Joint Chiefs at the time, Jack Vesey, who was one that believed that we should never do another Vietnam, and he saw a peacekeeping mission in Lebanon as another Vietnam and was opposed to it. But as a good officer, once the president decided, he marched off and carried out his orders. So the whole process of deciding when to use military force was, I think, after the Vietnam War, more constrained than it might have been before that.
Did you find yourself, once you came into a policy role as opposed to essentially being an officer taking orders, did you find yourself having to essentially navigate the different perspectives that people came out of that war? Was that a large part of what you had to do as a policymaker?
Yes. As you probably know, the National Security Advisor's role is really an honest broker in the system and a coordinator to make sure that all of the relevant positions from the cabinet officers and the other officials in the executive branch get to the president and are presented in a fair way. And many times the National Security Advisor winds up being the peacemaker, trying to pull together the other members of the cabinet to prepare options for the president that cover a range of possibilities. And of course, in the end, the president is the decision maker. And as I said last night, usually it becomes a judgment call in the end as to what he decides to do.
You're being very modest. Certainly the National Security Advisor must also weigh in on what they think are the best of the options presented. Isn't that the case?
Well, yeah. During the years that I was there, for example, decision memoranda we tried to limit them to about 3 pages. President Reagan was the type of person that if you send him a 50-page document, he'd read it. He'd read it all, and he would remember it. But a president doesn't have time to read many 50-page documents. And so we tried to condense them down to 3 pages. And in those 3 pages, we would lay out, discuss the problem and lay out the options. And let's say it was an issue where the State Department disagreed with the Defense Department. And so the State Department the Secretary of State would have a recommendation. The Secretary of Defense would have a recommendation. But maybe those 2 recommendations didn't cover the range of possibilities. And so the National Security Advisor would add another option, which was often a combination of the previous 2. It was a sort of a compromise. Or it may have been an option that neither the Secretary of State nor the Secretary of Defense wanted to put forward. As you surmise, of course, the National Security Advisor is very close to the President. I mean, that's not to say the Secretary of State and the Secretary of Defense aren't, but the National Security Advisor is with the President every day, and that person understands the way the President is thinking about issues and is often in a position to craft an option that is more in line with the President's thinking. And so it's not unusual that the National Security Advisor's option or recommendation is the one that's taken. But it's not so much that the National Security Advisor is so much smarter, but it's simply that person is more aware of what the President's thinking.
You mentioned President Reagan. Tell us about the first time you met him and what your impressions were of him.
I'm trying to remember the first time. He was a very gracious man. Contrary to the public perception, he was very much an introvert. It was kind of interesting to be with him in the Oval Office. It was very clear that he was an introvert. But we'd walk out of the Oval Office together for a meeting, and as soon as he'd walk through the door, it was like he passed through a screen, and he then took on the role of an extrovert. In my opinion, his acting experience is very important for a president, and I think it's a good qualifier, because in many respects, the president has to take on the role of an actor to accomplish all sorts of things. He has to be sincere and believe in what he's saying, but the whole way he presents himself, communicates, the acting experience is very important.
How you ultimately became, as you said, a very close and important advisor to him. How did you build the relationship such that he eventually entrusted you with that closeness? Because you were not part of the inner circle coming from California, Ed Meese,
No.
And Mike Deaver and others. How did you kind of grow into this role?
Well, I went to the White House in May of 1981. It was just a couple of months after the attempted assassination of President Reagan. And there was some concern about the Situation Room's performance during the assassination attempt. And it was also just a few months into the administration. And as I was telling somebody yesterday, having come from the Navy, which is a very well-organized institution, when the White House, when the president begins a new administration, and especially when you change political parties, there's a lot of chaos in the White House. And there certainly was during the Reagan administration in the first year. And I suspect it's true. That's the only one I've experienced, but I'm pretty sure it's true of other administrations when they come in. There are no standard operating procedures. Nobody quite understands what they're supposed to do. And so when I came in in May of '81, I came as a military assistant to the then National Security Advisor. And one of my roles was to look at the organization in the national security area of the White House and the National Security Council staff, and see what improvements could be made, and so on. And so for the first couple of years, or first year and a half maybe, I had almost zero contact directly with the president. But then when the National Security Advisor changed, Bill Clark came in, and he was a longtime colleague of the president's. He had been his chief of staff when he was governor of California, and he came in to replace Richard Allen. And things began to change at that point. Bill would often take me up with meetings with the president. So by '82, I was seeing the president pretty regularly. The deputy National Security Advisor at the time was Bud McFarlane. And as I said earlier, we were involved in Lebanon. Bud was sent on a special mission to Lebanon, and so I took on the acting role of Clark's deputy in late '82. And at that point, I began to see the president every day. Then when Bill left to take over the Department of Interior, Bud moved up to be the National Security Advisor, and I moved up to be his deputy. So from then on, I was with the president every day, at least for an hour, sometimes longer than that. The National Security Advisor and the deputy wind up, at least in that administration, we wound up being with the president more hours per day than anybody else, probably including his wife. So I think it was the personal contact, to answer your question directly.
Yeah. You talk about the early years of the Reagan administration. What were the principal national security concerns? What was the world? Paint a picture for us. What the world was like. What worried the president? What did he principally focus on in the national security context, at least in the beginning years when he first took office?
He was very concerned about Central America, the spreading communism, Marxism in Central America. He wanted to not only stop it, but to roll it back. He very much believed in the Monroe Doctrine. And so Central America was very high on his priority list. Negotiations with the Soviet Union were also very high on his list from the very beginning. Very early on in the administration, he wanted to meet with the Soviet leadership. But if you recall, and I've forgotten the sequence of events, but the Soviet leadership kept changing or dying off during the early years, and also there was opposition in the cabinet, in the National Security Council, the statutory National Security Council, in the president meeting with the Soviet leader too soon.
Explain that. Why?
Well, when President Reagan came into office and replaced President Carter, the feeling of the president was that our defense forces had been cut back too far, were in a poor state of repair in terms of our weapon systems, and so the president named Caspar Weinberger to be the Secretary of Defense, and his mission was to rebuild the defense forces of the United States, because as a fallout of Vietnam, there had been a dramatic reduction. And the president thought that the only way to in the Cold War, and he thought this from the very beginning, was to build up our defenses so that we were in a better negotiating position and then negotiate with the Soviet Union. Now, he was more interested personally in beginning the negotiations earlier than, say, Secretary Weinberger. And so he didn't begin immediately, but as soon as Gorbachev came to power in the Soviet Union, and it was several of the years then into the administration, we had begun building up the defense forces. And at that point, everybody agreed that that was a good time for him to begin. So from that time on, he was very interested in reaching some resolutions with the Soviet Union. So Soviet Union was very high on his priority list. And it was not only, the way I've described it so far, it sounds like a purely defense military sort of confrontation. That was not the case. We really, we had a military strategy, an economic strategy, a diplomatic strategy, and a public diplomacy strategy with respect to the Soviet Union. And we employed various techniques in all of those areas to put pressure on the Soviet Union. The President and some of us in the White House could foresee the economic collapse of the Soviet Union. We couldn't get the intelligence community to ever agree with our assessment of what was happening. And in the end, it turned out the President was right.
Well, you've said a number of interesting things I want to follow up on there. On the one hand, the President was committed to the eventual destruction or removal of the Soviet Union. That was an aspiration.
Yeah.
On the other hand, you said he wanted to engage them in negotiations.
Right. Well,
how do you reconcile those what seem to be contradictory instincts?
Fair point, which I should explain. The President, and as you will recall, in one of his speeches, described the Soviet Union as an evil empire. The President was always very clear in his mind and made a distinction between the Soviet Union, which was a form of government, and the people of the Soviet Union, for example, the Russians. What the President wanted to accomplish was to change their form of government, to eliminate the Soviet Union, which had expansionary ideas of expanding communism through the rest of the world. That's what he wanted to stop. He felt that the Russian people were being ill-served by their government, and was for the Russian people. And the reason he wanted to negotiate was, for one area of negotiations was in the arms control area. And he thought that the policy that had been in place for many years of mutual assured destruction, where we threatened the Soviet Union with obliteration and they threatened us with obliteration, and so you reach some form of stability. The President thought that wasn't a very moral solution, and was anxious to at least reduce, if not eliminate, nuclear weapons. And so he was anxious to talk with the Soviet leadership about that. At the same time, he wanted to apply economic pressure on the Soviet Union to get them to stop their expansionary moves, and the hope, although he probably never expressed it in a speech that I can recall, but to bring an end to that form of government in the Soviet Union. So there's a difference between government and organizations and the people.
Well, and that has great relevance to our modern times. How can a president of the United States communicate that to the people he's trying to, and can you be effective in essentially targeting a message against the government without the people thinking that they themselves are threatened by those words? And I'm talking, of course, about President Bush ultimately borrowed President Reagan's phrase and called three countries the axis of evil, a twist on the original evil empire. And there's great debate about whether using that kind of terminology is helpful. So how do you think that the message that President Reagan was trying to deliver was really received by the Russian people in the way it was intended?
Well, it's not Russia, but let me give you an example. In Poland, there was an opposition leader in Poland, and at the president's direction, we took a lot of actions to provide support to that leader in the form of printing presses, copying machines, fax machines, and it was very clear and my mind's gone blank, the name of the Polish leader, Lech Walesa, and the organization was called Solidarity. I haven't thought about that in a long time. And it was very clear to Lech Walesa and Solidarity that the United States was helping. And I'm sure that spread throughout the people of Poland. So there was a recognition that the United States was opposed to the Polish government, which was a puppet of the Soviet Union, but they were for the people. Interestingly enough, back to my connection with technology, during that period of time, I supported a position of being willing to give if necessary, as many personal computers to the Soviet Union as they wanted. Now, it turned out that I didn't win the argument, the Defense Department did, because they argued that the technology in the PC, the personal computer at the time, was more sophisticated than the technology that we had in our weapons fire control systems, and they didn't want the Soviet Union, using the parts. But my idea was that the more means of communications that you can provide to people of an oppressed country, the less likelihood that the controlling regime can stay in place. I think that it was certainly demonstrated not with personal computers, but with printing presses and Xerox machines and copying machines in Poland. Once people can communicate freely amongst themselves and find out what's happening in the rest of the world, the more difficult it is for an oppressive regime to stay in place.
I want to pick up on one other thing you mentioned before about the thought about what the state of the Soviet Union was. Here, it was our number one threat, our number one concern coming into the office. Was there an inkling, in the White House, in the Reagan administration, in the early years, that within 10 years, a decade, that the Soviet Union would be no more? Was that a notion that really could have been entertained at that time?
I'm not sure it could have been entertained in 1981, but certainly by the time I left in the end of 1986, it was very clear to me and I think to the president that the Soviet Union was failing. I'm not sure that, well, we certainly didn't predict when, for example, the Berlin Wall would come down, but it was something that we contemplated would happen. We just we didn't know exactly when.
During the 1980s, terrorism was a topic that certainly took up much of your time and energy of the administration. What was the perception of the threat from terrorism then, and what did you think about what was causing those problems, the roots of terrorism as we experienced it in the 1980s?
Well, there's a recent book published by a University of Virginia professor, Tim Naftali, called The Blind Spot, and it covers the history of counterterrorism in the United States from 1950 to the present day. So terrorism has been going on for a long time. Now, in the 80s, it began to be a problem that we focused on very early. It was primarily related at the time to Israel's existence. And the United States has always been a great friend and ally of Israel, and that is held against the United States by some proportion of the population in the Middle East. And so we began to experience terrorist attacks in Lebanon and in the Middle East, supported by organizations, or accomplished by organizations that were getting support from Iran and Syria, as is true today. Now, the level of severity of the attacks that occurred during that period of time did not approach what happened on 9/11. But we began actively organizing and figuring out how we could combat terrorism, and which in my days it culminated in a successful operation against a cruise ship named the Achille Lauro, which was an Italian passenger ship, cruise ship, that had American tourists on board. It was taken over by a terrorist group, and to make a long story shorter, eventually we captured the terrorists and turned them over to Italian authorities. But that whole operation was the result of a lot of consideration and thinking about how we could use our military forces to handle the consequence management, or after the fact, of a terrorist attack. Our focus then was primarily that. It was how to get captives back, how to capture terrorists. We began thinking about how to deter the terrorists and to preempt them. I should say not so much deter, but preempt them from taking action. But the level of the attacks that we had experienced were nothing like 9/11, and I'm not sure that we could have predicted then that something as severe as 9/11 would happen, an attack, in the United States. Well, I know I did not foresee that in the 80s. as time went on in the 90s, it became clearer that that was a potential possibility.
You talk about the strategy you were dealing with to try to confront terrorism in 2 episodes. Military strikes against Libya as a punishment, in a sense, for their action against their terrorist support, yet a withdrawal of American troops after the terrorist incident in Beirut. And it's that, in fact, that episode is one of the things bin Laden sometimes points to as an example of how, in his view, that America was weak, that we would leave once confronted. So how do you reconcile, in some ways, successful and aggressive action to our response to terrorism in Beirut, and what kinds of lessons should we draw from those?
Well, there was a lot of dissension within the National Security Council about going into Beirut, into Lebanon, in the beginning. As I said earlier, it was not originally supported by the chairman or the Secretary of Defense, for that matter. Frankly, we didn't carry that off very well. And there were some, even then, there were some significant intelligence problems. For example, our embassy in downtown Beirut was bombed. The embassy moved out to the suburbs in Beirut, and it was later bombed. It turned out that we had intelligence that a priori, the suburban bombing, that if it had been focused on, would have indicated that they were planning an attack against the suburban embassy. However, the right people didn't see the piece of intelligence until after the fact, and that was, at that point, we began to take action to establish what eventually became the Counterterrorism Center at CIA. The fellows that started that were involved in following up from the Beirut bombing and improving the flow of intelligence to the relevant people that were responsible for protecting the embassy. Let's see, what was the rest of your question?
Well, we were talking about how the perception that of our withdrawal led to our strategy against terrorists.
Yeah, and so the president wanted to retaliate against terrorist acts, and there wasn't agreement within the National Security Council on that. It was primarily opposition from the chairman and the Secretary of Defense. And every time we had an opportunity to retaliate, there was always some missing piece and some excuse, some reason not to do it that won out in the end. But finally, in December of '85 or January of '86, the president signed, and the president was getting rather upset about this, I should say. And so in that time period, end of '85, he signed a decision directive that directed the Defense Department to prepare plans for an attack against Tripoli, very specifically, that could be carried out within days of some future terrorist incident that we could link directly to Tripoli, to Gaddafi's regime. And so the whole point of this decision directive was that the next time there was a terrorist incident, the president didn't want any excuses that something wasn't ready. And so then a few months later, an incident happened in Germany, and the intelligence pointed very clearly at Libya, and we carried out the raid on Tripoli in April of 1986. And I guess there is some disagreement today on the eventual result, but I feel that it had a significant impact on Libya's carrying out or supporting terrorist attacks against the United States for some period of time.
As you've articulated the policy that's developing, it was to confront, not negotiate with terrorists. That's certainly what happened in Achille Lauro. Yet ultimately, the administration did engage in negotiations with Iran for release of hostages. How did that come about?
Well, again, the president viewed, he had a distinctly different way of thinking about organizations, governments, compared to the people that were involved. He was very empathetic and sympathetic with people in distress. And in the Iran case, the president was personally very concerned about the hostages that had been taken in Beirut. And he wanted to figure out a way of getting them back. At the same time, there were some of us, the president included, who wanted to try to improve relations with Iran. We knew that they were supporting terrorist activity, the Hezbollah in Lebanon, and we were beginning to get feelers from various channels that there were some moderate people in Iran that wanted to improve the relations with the United States. And so the president decided that that he would open up a channel of communications with these people in the hopes of, number one, improving relations with the United States, and number two, getting our hostages back. And that led to his decision to provide a low level of weapons to Iran. As you recall, at the time they were engaged in a war with Iraq. And our main objective at that point was not for either side to win, but to simply call a halt to the war. There, as you might expect, there were divisions in the government. I mean, some wanted us to side with Iraq, some didn't want us to deal with Iran, but it was the president's decision, and I frankly think he made the right decision, that we try to get our hostages back with Iranian help and try to improve relations with Iran.
It was this policy in Iran to get the hostage back that was connected ultimately to the Iran-Contra scandal, right, which led to your resignation from office. Much has been written, and we don't need to go into great detail today about that, but I guess my question is...
Much is not very accurate, by the way. But.
Well, I'm not sure we have time to go over the entirety of that, but I guess my question about that is, how should history look back on that incident. When I think about it, in some ways, I listen to things that are written today about how Vice President Cheney and Secretary Rumsfeld, former Secretary Rumsfeld, when they were in the White House in the Ford administration, feeling that the executive branch had become too weakened, especially in the national security sphere, and that they want to, at least now, reassert that authority. Was that an attitude that kind of prevailed also when you were in the White House, and is that part of what may have led to Iran-Contra?
Well, as you probably know, throughout the history of the United States, there has always, even going back to the Revolutionary War, and conflict between the legislature and the executive branch of government. And of course, the way our Constitution is written, there are these checks and balances. And the presidents, and not just Republican presidents, but presidents of all political parties, have felt that the Constitution gives them certain authorities that override anything the legislature does. And so it's, in our form of government, it's a constant struggle. It's really, I think, more rare when that struggle doesn't come to the forefront. I mean, times of true peace and great economy and everybody getting along fine are very rare. And when there's any kind of conflict involved, the struggle between a president and the Congress is a natural thing that happens, and it happens because of the way our Constitution is written. So I think, on reflection, I think there was a feeling at the beginning of the Reagan administration that the executive branch, the president, needed to exercise power more. And for example, at the end of the Vietnam War, there was or during the Vietnam War, there was a War Powers Resolution passed, which requires the president to report to Congress about the deployment of military forces. This is sort of, to some extent, this goes back to our earlier discussion about what's a war and a declaration of war. But under the War Powers Resolution, it requires a president to report, I forget the exact
90 days maybe, or
requirements.
60 days.
But if you notice, every time a president, since that resolution was passed, and it is a resolution, ever since that resolution was passed, when a president reports, he doesn't report in accordance with this resolution, but and I don't think the report ever makes any connection with the War Powers Resolution, but it provides the same kind of information. And that's a little bit of a marker saying, we don't think that the War Powers Resolution really applies to the president. But, and then another example is that Executive Order 12333, which organizes the National Security Organization, that establishes the responsibilities of its principals, was rewritten at the beginning of the Reagan administration. Prior to that time, that executive order was a list of thou shall nots, thou shall not. In 1981, it was rewritten to provide a more positive indication of what the various agency directors should be doing. And in my view, if you read between the lines of that, that's another marker that the president is saying that, I have constitutional responsibilities and I'm going to carry those out no matter what you think.
And how does that essentially link ourselves to Iran-Contra? And, we don't have the time to go into great detail, but how do you think history should look back on that incident? What were the lessons of that?
Well, it was basically a political difference between the president and the Congress, which was then turned into a criminal incident, which many of my supporters think was wrong. It should have remained as a political issue, not a criminal issue. But the House, which was led by Speaker Tip O'Neill, led an effort that opposed the president's policy in Central America. And there were a series of amendments that were placed on the Defense Department's appropriation bill that prohibited appropriated funds for being used. On the other hand, the Boland amendments were very, they left a lot of loopholes. In my view, it was very clear to most of the people on the Hill exactly what we were doing, that we were providing, that the NSC staff was arranging for private funding for the Contra elements in Central America, which, in our view, was not prohibited by the Boland Amendment because it was only talking about appropriated funds. There were many congressmen of both parties that knew exactly what we were doing. In fact, Oliver North, who ran part of that program, when he'd be on the Hill, congressmen would come up to him and say, "Ollie, how's it going? Or are they getting the support they need?" The Congress, especially the opposition party, didn't want to be seen as supporting the Contras, but on the other hand, in my view, they didn't want to be held responsible for losing Central America to communism. And so it was frankly, in my view, they were trying to have their cake and eat it too, in being publicly opposed to the policy, but understanding that the policy was being carried out in other ways. And history, I think, will eventually paint a clearer picture of actually what happened.
I think it's important that we at least have a short moment at the end of this interview to skip ahead now 20 years and talk about your involvement in, after 9/11, the creation of a technology research and development program called Total Information Awareness. And again, maybe perhaps misunderstood by the public, and it was terminated before it really could get going. I want to give you an opportunity to briefly explain what you were trying to achieve, and maybe, because we're coming to the end, what your hopes for the future in that area would be.
Well, David, right after 9/11, I and a lot of my colleagues were really frustrated that we weren't able to prevent that event. And I had been working with DARPA, the Defense Department's Research and Projects Agency, prior to that as an advisor. And we had thought about the concept of total information awareness. Now, total is an exaggerated term in this case, but we had some ideas about how to achieve that, and I did not want to have to come back into government to do it. I knew that I would be controversial because of the history of Iran-Contra, and so in talking to the director of DARPA, Dr. Tony Tether at the time, he wasn't willing to go forward with the program because he didn't have anybody to put in charge of it. And so finally I agreed to come back into government for a limited period of time to get the program started so that we could have better collaboration and information sharing within the national security community, better access to data, better analytical tools to figure out what it all means. And so the whole gamut of activity that needed to go on to prevent or preempt future terrorist attacks, largely aided by technology that was either available or that we could develop. And in the beginning, we thought about making the whole program classified, but we quickly decided that that was not the way to go. That there were lots of things, lots of areas of technology where we didn't have a solution and we were looking for creative ideas. And if we had made the program classified, it would have been harder to get creative ideas from the outside. So we decided to make it unclassified and be very open about it. We issued, so I came back into the government in January of 2002 and opened this office. And in fact, by February of 2002, we were conducting some experiments based on some previous work that we'd been working on. So we got off to a very fast start. We issued a broad agency announcement, which is DARPA's form of request for proposals, that was unclassified, that laid out all that the problems that the United States was facing and the kind of technology solutions that we were looking for. The proposals came back in. We eventually awarded about $150 million in development contracts, and so we're off to a fast start. In August of that year, I spoke at a conference that DARPA holds every couple of years where there are a couple thousand participants, including the trade press. And so we were very open about what we were trying to do. And again, it was a research and development program to perform experiments to see if it was feasible to analyze masses of data to try to find the patterns of activities that terrorists would have to perform in order to carry out an attack. And of course, privacy becomes a big issue in this because the transactions that terrorists conduct are mixed in with the transactions of a lot of innocent people. And by transactions, I mean all sorts of buying things, making telephone calls, traveling by airplane or train or whatever. But all those things are transactions, and in our electronic age today, a signature of that activity is left in the information space. So in addition to working on the technologies to do better data analysis, we wanted to work on technologies that would protect the privacy of non-terrorists. But in the beginning, it was hard. I mean, the research and development community at large, including, which by the way includes universities such as Duke, there weren't many ideas out there about how to protect the privacy in a system like this. But eventually we did get some ideas and we began research on that. But the various privacy advocacy groups like the ACLU and EPIC and others began to attack the program on the basis that, and the way it was put at the time was that we were at the time violating people's privacy. And of course, it was a research and development program. Data that was being used was foreign data. We had also to simulate activity in the United States. We were using simulated data, which was not real. But Whether they misunderstood or were deliberately misinterpreting it to outrage people is not clear to me. But they wanted to stop the technology development so there wouldn't be any future possibility of doing this sort of thing. And one of my longtime antagonists from the New York Times wrote a very scathing, inaccurate op-ed piece. Then Congress began to pay attention, and it was as if we had never briefed the Congress and the congressional staffs on what we were doing, which we had done in hours of briefings back in the beginning of 2002. But honestly, many of the congressmen probably didn't understand what we were doing. As you well understand, a lot of activity on the Hill is done by the staffs. But anyway, so it became a political issue, described as, it was put in terms of worried about the people's privacy, and here this rogue person, Admiral Poindexter in the Defense Department, is going off establishing this Orwellian system called total information awareness. And so, as I had said earlier, that I didn't want to have to come back into the government to get this started, but I eventually agreed for a limited time. And so in August of 2003, by that time I'd been in DARPA for 20 months. We'd gotten the program started, so I resigned. I actually wanted to leave earlier, but the director of DARPA persuaded me to stay on a little longer. But eventually, in August, I had sort of had my fill of it, and left government for the last time.
Well, perhaps what you've done will ultimately lead to technologies that will both protect privacy and enhance
There's a lot of
security.
carryover, and so in many respects, I think that we were successful in getting things started.
Well, John Poindexter, you've had a long and fascinating career, and we're very grateful here at Duke for you coming here and sharing that with us and documenting it for history. This has been part of the Living History series at Duke University with Admiral John Poindexter.